All right, the recorder's on, but it's this notion of kind of the logic that goes through this project or through this process, and there is a set of logic to it that um, kind of determines how it goes. You know how certain things fit in at different places, and once we kind of talk through that just a little bit, then I want to shift off onto kind of laying the framework or the groundwork for the logic that underlies quantitative analysis, see how far we get. If we get through all of that, I don't know that we will, but we'll get through a certain portion of that. And then we'll pick the rest of that up. I'll do the rest of that next week in another help session and then pick up on the qualitative pieces. But at the same time, always leaving some time at the beginning to, uh, you know, talk about projects and things like that. Uh, I've already met with, I don't know, 5 or 6 folks uh, by Zoom. And yeah, I think those have been fairly positive uh, things. And so we'll continue to do that. And, it's not like I'm going anywhere. If it's, I'll try to slide into a meeting slot that works for you. But if, I'll let you know real quick if there's something that I can't get around. And there are a few of those things. I have a uh, dissertation defense that I have to chair this week. So, uh, you know, uh, she'll be a little panicky and she'll be a little stressed out. And so we'll have to talk every day for a little while till we get to Thursday, and it should be just fine. But she's just, that's kind of what the way this thing plays out. And so then you have to kind of, make yourself available as much as you can. But anyhow, I will meet wherever, however it works best for you. I think the Zoom, works pretty well for me with the setup I've gotten back into now. So, we'll kind of go from there. Um, but first, so the first thing is, kind of, this project outline. And let me just, uh, I think I sent it to you in an email that it really kind of divides up in like 3 sections, 3 kind of segments to this thing. The first thing is always arriving at a question, or at least a area, a research, some sort of concept that you want to take a look at. Um, and sometimes that's a flyer, and sometimes it's a follow up to something you did previously, and so there's all kinds of things that where it can come from, or it might be a kind of an idea that you're interested in to know a whole lot more about, because it might somewhere down the road you might want to make a play at a doctorate, and it's always good to have a good solid sort of set of uh, facts and skills and all under your belt when you do that. Uh, but whatever that question is, inevitably always uh, is just there to drive you in the direction of the research, of the literature, because the probably the beginning point is figure out what you want to look at and what you want to work with. And then the very second point is, okay, let's see how much I can find out about that in literature. Because it's, if it's a done deal and settled stuff and things like that, it's no sense doing it. If it's been done, 10 times in a setting, similar to yours, or in your setting or whatever, there's no sense doing it. And so what you want to know is, okay, how much do I know about this, and what don't I know? And the don't I know part can be one of those deals where it's either, as I mentioned last time, it's either right or wrong, or left or right, or which one of these 2 or 3 things is actually going on. And so it may be just, okay, let's figure out what's true here. Sometimes it's exploratory. I mean, you just trying to find out more about something because you don't know anything about it. For example, right now we don't know anything about student. Well, one of your compatriots is doing something on, student engagement for a student with a handicap, and somebody else was talking about interest, looking at something like student interest or whatever. But whatever it is, you have to ground it somehow in the literature. Now, what do I mean by ground it? You either have to support the direction you're wanting to go amongst kind of an objective view of what the general sense in the field is. I mean, people either generally think it's like this or like that, or there are 2 or 3 theories here, and so what you end up doing eventually is you end up grounding the reason you do your research in some piece or some fabric within the literature. Now, it might be a theory, a philosophy, or a theory. Post-structuralism as applied to online instruction. I don't know. It can be a theoretical thing based around a philosophical stance, and that tends to be mostly qualitative most of the time. Or it can be, based on what we know, here's what we predict would happen. If we did this over here, this will happen. And so, and that tends to be more quantitative in nature, but you have to, you really kind of have to let the question lead you to the literature, and the literature leads you to what you know. And so at the end of the literature chapter, there's a little summary piece there, and we won't get too awfully deep into that talks about either what's called a conceptual framework. That's when you're just kind of testing something to see if our predictions actually turn out, or a theoretical framework, and that is when you're taking sort of a philosophical stance and trying to collect information to either know more about it or to help understand it a little bit better. And that becomes much more localized, and is really not one of those things that you can use to make big decisions about, but it is one of those things you can use to understand a whole lot more about something, generally from the perspective of the participants. But it's this notion of where are you and where's the literature at? Are we still trying to figure out the theoretical pieces of it? Or are we still, now can make some predictions, and let's see if those work, to see if it actually works. So, that kind of drives, then the easiest part in the world is the methodology. But you have to start with the question, the literature, pretty good dive in literature, and that should be kind of where you're at now. And then bingo, then we can get into the methodology. And, once we get into that methodology, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on little nuances, because, before you would actually, do this type of research and spend time doing it, you would probably want to have a couple of additional research methods courses in place, so that you kind of knew a little bit more about how to provide the rigor for these things. And so it is this is basically an introduction. So remember that. And so we're not going to go into explicit detail in the methodology. We're going to talk about what data would you need to have to answer your questions. Is that data available, or are you going to have to generate it? And, what does it look like? How does it sound? And, all those things after, but only after you have a question and a little bit about what's in the literature about that question. And so a lot of this is the part of research that I've grown to, what's the proper term for this? Detest over the years is doing these long lit reviews. But in my earlier times, that's just what you had to do. You did the lit reviews and figured out what you could know and what you couldn't know, and how best to go about doing it. And so that becomes the primary thing. And if you look at the first 3 sections, the first two sections of this project, the first section is the question, which includes a rationale and kind of a context. What's the context of this question? Why is it suddenly a question that we need to answer? And what's the rationale? Who will benefit? How might they benefit? What might you be able to add back to the literature? Any and all of those things. And so it becomes that is kind of the framework of the question in that first section. Second section is all lit review. And those will vary a lot depending on the content area and the nature of the literature and all that. I mean, you will organize them in different ways because you'll organize them in logical ways. That's just natural for you to do. And you'll put them into different camps, or you'll put a chronology around them and say, this is where we were 30 years ago, it's 40, 50, or there'll be an order that comes about as you group them into common content, common themes. And so the way in which you construct your lit review the narrative will be quite a bit different for each of you. But then at the end of it, the very last paragraph or a couple of paragraphs or whatever of the lit review is that either the conceptual framework, the study or the studies or the history that lets you do a certain type of research that leads you to believe it might be useful to do that, and here's what we would predict would happen, or a theoretical framework or a theoretical model, a philosophy or an idea that you might base the research around. And so those things are, the first two sections, the first two big pieces of it, outside of all the APA stuff, I almost slipped up there. But, those are the things that have to do with, what a research proposal is going to look like. And you don't necessarily burn through all the details on the methodology at that point, because you don't want people to start saying, well, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. And so you want to just talk about the kind of data you need. Do you have it, or do you need to collect it, and all that sort of stuff. I said there were three sections. The first broad section is the question and the literature. Second broad section is figuring out the methodology and actually doing the experiment if we're going to do that. And then the third section is, okay, what does any of that mean? What did we find? How do we answer our questions? How does it fit in the literature? How does it, what does it tell us about a decision we need to make? And what other questions does it pose for us? I mean, what's the next thing that we need to look at? What's the next research we might do? Or what are implications for, other grad students' research? And so, it's the logic doesn't change. It's the same logic in a prospectus and a research report as it is in a thesis and or a dissertation. It's very much this empirical model that goes all the way back to Aristotle. This idea of collecting evidence to see the truth in the world, as opposed to just accepting it from other folks. And some sort of hypothesize that's also the beginning of sort of the threads of rational thought. That I then later on, leads to the Enlightenment and the Scottish Renaissance and Scottish Enlightenment. I'm almost full-blooded Scotch, so I have to take advantage of the fact that our founding fathers were reading books about the Scottish Renaissance and Scottish Enlightenment at the time that they wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all that. So it was kind of like, you know, us Scots kind of got it all going. And the Americans were a little late to the table, but that's okay. You know, we've kind of gotten to used to you a bit. You know, y'all are okay. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of the flow of this thing, and you can't think of just about pieces. You have to think about how this logic flows. And, you know, it inevitably flows right into the next section, which, I mean, it just becomes, you know, the logical thing, the next thing to do. But it has to be tied together by this thread of an idea that starts at the beginning and goes all the way through. And then if you actually did the research and you reported it, you would be bringing it back in the circle, back to the beginning, and, you know, see how it impacted your question, see how it stacked up against the literature. Did it inform it? Did it contest it? You know, what happened when you look at the literature, and go through the cycle again, inevitably. But, you know, it is a sort of a cyclical empirical process, and that's what Aristotle had convinced himself was the best way to view the world, I guess. Any thoughts, questions? I mean, I know, you know, this stuff jazzes me up, but I know it's not stuff of student legend, shall we say.
I have a question, sir.
Yeah.
When it comes to the methodology piece, we're not actually doing the methodology, or are we finding studies that have, that's where I'm a little confused. Like, what are we doing with that?
You're actually, all you're doing is you are proposing, this is the way I would do the research. That's 6/10 of it. You don't know how it would turn out because you haven't collected data.
Right.
And you don't really know how it's going to impact things. We'll conjecture on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it is, I mean, that's the end of it. That's the ending. You get to the point where you figured out the methodology.
So that should be basically part of the conclusion?
No, there are no conclusions.
There's no conclusion. It's just the ending then, like, what did we find? That goes with the methodology, basically?
Yeah, it is the methodology. Yeah.
Okay, so I got that mixed up then. Okay.
Yeah.
So
There is no data. There is no information to summarize. Now, unless you happen to have information, it's something you're working on or whatever, then, you know, I'll certainly help you get through all that stuff. But yeah, that's the only requirement for the course is the proposal.
Okay. And then in the lit review, are we trying to find other studies like the one that maybe we've done, or
similar, or, you know, contextually, you might find, for example, in higher ed, we very often find studies in higher ed that we then try to replicate in, you know, two-year schools and smaller institutions, just to see if what worked at Ohio State, you know, works at you know, Leeds McRae, or, you know, whatever. That we want to know, is this dependent upon, you know, how much currency, how much resource, how much whatever size, you know, what might work in an institution of 30,000 it just might not work at an institution of you know, 1,000, 3,000, something like that. And so you have typically in the social sciences, you'll find that you may not find the exact fit for what it is that you're wanting to ask. And so you kind of branch out ever so slightly. And if you're looking at what happened in a two-year school, maybe you want to look at studies related to four-year schools too. Just because you know, sometimes the the theoretical piece or the conceptual framework piece can be the same, and you just are doing it in an entirely different context, a smaller school, smaller setting, fewer resources, whatever. I mean, rural area versus urban area versus urban institution. And so a lot of the research that people do is really kind of replicative. I mean, you just go in and do another iteration of someone else's study or a series of studies that's similar enough so that you can, kind of tie it to those a little bit and see how much difference it makes. But with the methodology common enough that, you can make those comparisons. You can say, okay, well, it worked at Ohio State, but, it didn't work at Lees McRae, or vice versa.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I don't want to take up too much time.
No problem. Any else have any thoughts about that? I mean, you don't have to. I don't want to leave without having given you the opportunity to say something or ask something. Okay. So that's and I'll, as I said, over the next, 3 weeks, I'll be here every Monday night. And so I'm recording these things and we're putting these up plus a few more types of, videos that had to do a little bit more detail about methodology, maybe that, would be better probably done through watching a video and reading a couple of sources as opposed to, doing it here. So we'll, try to burn off these last 3 or 4 weeks just as hard as we can and see how it goes. I mean, I'm not, at this point, I'm not slightest bit concerned about the electoral process because what's done's done. I mean, I think it's about, whatever the direction is, nobody's changing their mind at this point. That's just fool's gold. Whoever believes whatever you believe, so be it. Go out and vote. But I don't worry about it when we get this close to elections. I just say, well, that's going to be what's going to be. Let go. And of course, I can't, in my Scottish sort of ways, I'm not sure how that will work once we actually have a decision, but we'll see. We'll see how we can maintain that calm Scottish demeanor. Let's see. Okay.
It might cause you to drink a little bit more depending on depending on which side you're on. I don't know. I don't ask, but
yeah, we may have that ship may have left already.
That could be the magic elixir. It might not answer the question. It just make you feel better.
Yeah, it doesn't feel it. And
what part of Scotland is your family from?
Over on the eastern part, Perth. What is it? Perthshire, Perth something.
Well, then I may be in relation to you, because I have family on my mom's side from Perth, Scotland. So
I think it's Perth. And
yeah, Perth. We've traced it back from the 1700s. But my relative who got here was kicked out of Scotland because he was a little rebel. He joined the military to go against something, and they shipped him to Jamestown, Virginia, and that's how we got here.
Well, my fifth or sixth, I think it's fifth great grandfather, fifth or sixth. He was born in Perth, but by the time he was 20 years old, teenager, 20 years old, he was living. No, he was born in Ulster. He was born in Ulster, but my family had immigrated from Scotland to Ulster in probably the early 1600s, somewhere along there. And that was at the behest of the British, who wanted a Protestant enclave in Ulster. And so there were a lot of Protestant Scotlands because they were just contrarians to begin with. And so we ended up, I'm what's known as an Ulster Scot. And so we ended up in Ulster, Ireland. And then by the time he was late 20s, was in London and gotten himself into trouble, and it was either go to Whitehall or Newcastle, one of the prisons, or get on a boat as an indentured servant. And so he came over in servitude for 3 years in South Carolina, and then ended up out in the mountains of Western Virginia, and all that sort of stuff. So these histories they're very, very interesting when you start digging back through them. But yeah, Perth, go Perth.
I know, and my
That's
family,
yeah.
my relative was an indentured servant as well, and
Yeah.
then went to the coal fields, and that's where they stayed.
Yeah. Well, we got kicked out and ended up in the woods, up in the mountains. So it worked out okay. We've done pretty well. But yeah, I mean, I don't know where I went with that, but I'll get off of that now. But the thing about, there's a couple of really broad sort of notions that I might turn on my little overhead thing here in a second and talk very briefly about, that form the foundation for quantitative inquiry. There are 3 or 4 things, but they all have to do with what data looks like. And they all go back to our ability to know the truth about things, or know the probability of things having, not complete information, because we never have complete information. And there's a philosophical theory attached to this, but it's also a mathematical theory, but we'll approach it from the philosophical side, and it's called counterfactual theory. Just like it sounds, counterfactual and in theory. And essentially, the perfect example I always use of this, I always use it in class, so if you've heard it before, I'm sorry, is that, if you have you get a headache, take a couple of aspirin, headache goes away. So your natural deductive logic is, okay, the aspirin got rid of the headache. But you can't know what would have happened otherwise. That's the counterfactual. Under that exact same set of circumstances, what was different between taking an aspirin and not taking an aspirin? Because you can't know, because you can't see the same event at the same time under 2 different circumstances. And later on, that led up to some work with some of the quantum theory stuff, because it's such a powerful sort of notion. But it is that our knowledge is imperfect, our ability to interpret things is imperfect. We can't know everything, and so we can't be for sure about anything. There is no 100% surety, because if it's like saying, every time anybody takes up smoking cigarettes is going to get lung cancer. Well, no, they don't. And some people get lung cancer that never smoked a day in their life, or wasn't even around a smoker. And so it's, we can never know every possible variable in the equation. And we can only look generally at about 2 variables at a time. That's about the best we can do. And so we have to realize that, there'll always be some nagging doubt about any conclusion or any result we come to. But we do have one benefit. We do have one thing working in our direction, and it's this notion that we're more alike than we are different. And, from a pure, once again, philosophical perspective, it's called being normal. If you're most of the things that we can measure each other in, we're within the range of normal. We're not in exceptional, we're normal. And that tends to be somewhere near the average. In fact, it tends to be right on the average, normality. Now, from there, we can transfer that into, a mathematical concept or a statistical concept that says we can predict what's the likelihood of something being within a certain range. And so we can define exceptional, which we call significant. We can define exceptional as something that's not in that normal range. And that just happens to work for everything that occurs randomly in the universe. If you look at the brightness of the stars, you look at all the, the different fluctuations in energy levels, and space is never empty, but it will be distributed in a normal pattern where there'll be, most of it will be kind of on the average side of things, and some will be exceptionally bright if we're talking about stars, and others will be exceptionally dim, and some will be exceptionally light, and some will be exceptionally dense, and but most all of them will be normal. Yeah, maybe that's because our perceptions are so limited, and our ability to see these things is so limited. But it's more likely than not because that's just the nature of things. The world and the universe in which we live is pretty much a normal environment. Normal being average. Yeah. When we translate normality to data, we also find that, when we collect data, what we actually collect is not accurate. Never is. There's always a component of error. E-R-R-O-R. Yes, that's the actual word. It's just not the way you pronounce it on the Carolina border, but error. But it is, and we, just like everything else, error is distributed normally. And to give you an example of that, it's when they say that, somebody is, 2 points ahead of somebody else within the margin of error of 4 points. Well, 4 points each way is the limits of that margin of error. And it's normal, so it's closer to the mean, more of it's closer to the mean, but as it goes down and away, it moves further away from the mean. And so when they say, somebody's within the margin of error and so-and-so is 3 points up, and, the margin of error is 4 points, it's not saying that they're equal, that they're statistically tied. That's an incorrect statement. It's saying that one of them's error is way on one end and the other one is way on the other end, but theoretically they could still be overlapping, but that might be only a 10% chance. Or it might be a 50% chance. And so not all margin of error means margin of error. It just means that, these are the limits of this normal distribution of error. Now, if the error is random, we don't worry about it. We just know that there's some more measurement error in the data. And so if if the distribution of it's normal, then we don't worry about that kind of error. But if we find that the actual error, the amount of actual error, is different from what we would see if it were purely normal, then that extra bit of error, whatever it is, that extra little degree of error, we call, structural error or systematic error. I mean, there's all kinds of terms for it, but it basically means something else is going on here besides just random error. And all of our statistics are designed, and I'll even show you that, mathematically a little bit at some point in time, but all of our statistics are designed to measure random error against the error we actually detect. And if there is a big piece there, we know that structural error, and we figure out what's the proportion or the percentage based on the kind of data between those two groups or those two data points. And then, we do statistically, we're always shooting for the same target. We're always saying we want to be 95% sure. We want to be 95% sure that if we find something is going on here, there is a statistical relationship, that it's not a false positive. And so everything we do in quantitative analysis, once we get past just charts and descriptions and things like that, is this idea of what's the probability that it will look a certain way. And if the probability is, less than 5% chance of systematic error, false positive, then we're okay. And so we've taken this notion of normality and this notion of sort of randomness, random outcomes, and we have framed it within the context of error. Pure random error versus structural error. And so the only thing that we are doing when we're doing statistical analysis of quantitative data in a quantitative study is, making a prediction of how likely it is that these things actually are related. And that's all we're doing. It's a prediction. And if we're more than 95% sure, bingo, we call it statistically significant. And that, that's basically the underlying, grand notions that led us into quantitative inquiry. One was this idea of somehow figuring out how to get around this counterfactual error, counterfactual theory, by using, the study of error, ERROR, to figure out what's the likelihood. And so, stats never really tells you anything. It doesn't answer questions for you. It provides the probability of you being right on your question. But you can still be wrong. You can still be wrong. I mean, you can bet on the 99 to 1 shot. I mean, the 1 to 99 shot, and the one will hit every now and then. And so, you don't want to bet the farm on it. But, the idea is that, you have these things that allow us to infer relationship and infer causation sometimes. But that's all we're doing. We're inferring with some level of confidence. And the sort of the standard given level of confidence is 95% sure that we're right when we say that two things are related or are significantly related. See, not one formula, not one mathematical term, philosophical terms. Now, when we always have to keep in mind, though, that this relates back to the question. In order for us to do a quantitative study, we have to have a question that involves a predicted outcome. If we do this, will this happen? When I see this, will I also see that? And if that's not there, then it doesn't matter. And so we have to relate back to the question. If, however, we don't know enough about something to be able to say, okay, we can't really make this prediction, we need to understand this better, then you're talking a more inductive process, which is typically qualitative work. And different kind of data, different kind of analysis. But the quantitative piece is a deductive process, and it does involve, sort of a prediction of outcomes and to see if we can understand it. Questions, thoughts? God, don't get any further down the road here. You'll make my mind hurt. Okay. So, what is the great benefit in doing quantitative analysis? And the great benefit is that we are able to, because of the way it's structured, we are able to take outcomes that we might create in a, contrived setting, a control group, an experimental group, 2 or 3 different doses of a drug, whatever, that we might be able to take, results that we accomplish in a somewhat contrived setting and generalize it to a larger population that looks like these groups were drawn from. So, for example, if I were going to do a study on some type of material or some type of pedagogy for 5th graders, online 5th graders, I might do it at, I don't know, 3 or 4 schools, maybe 2 or 3 classrooms or something like that. But then the results I get from that small contrived setting, because it is representative of a larger setting, sample versus population, what I find in those sample settings, I then can generalize to the larger setting. And at least if you're working on, fixing a problem or figuring out something or whatever, you have a starting point. And once again, you're in the literature. You're looking to see what other people have done. And we know it worked in 5 classrooms. Will it work in an entire school division, or will it work in an entire state education system? And so the deductive quantitative logic allows us to do that, to make inferences as to how something that works in a small setting might work in a bigger setting. And so that's the basic advantage of quantitative analysis, and why we use it perhaps more than we need to or more than we should, is that it allows us to generalize. And so from an administrative point of view or a fiscal point of view, it allows you to learn things in smaller contrived settings that you can apply to a much bigger setting. And so it's cost efficient to do it that way. The problem on the qualitative side is that because it's inductive, you don't know how common or how representative the subjects you collect data from are, because you're going to collect a lot of data from not too many subjects. And you don't know if they are representative of the overall population. And so you can understand a lot about that one setting, and using qualitative approaches, you just can't generalize it to the bigger setting. So, once again, that too is kind of, there's a drawback for each one of them, but it's because they're suited for particular questions. The greatest misuse of quantitative is using it to develop a way of predicting individual outcomes, because it's an aggregate logic. it's based around having enough subjects or enough data points to infer normality. And so you can't, what you know about a group or between groups or whatever. You don't know about individuals in a group because they'll be normally distributed within the group. So it is we call that the ecological fallacy, but it simply means you can't take aggregate data and use it to predict individual outcomes. Quantitative data allows you to make decisions about systems or methods or things like that. It does not allow you to make decisions between individuals. And so that's the primary drawback on the thing. In terms of how it's misused, those of you that are familiar with EVOS and other state accountability systems, understand the misuse of it, because we're always constantly using aggregate data to try to predict how individual students might respond. And you'll be right sometimes. In fact, you'll be right most of the time because of that normality thing. But you won't be right all the time. And depending, the students or individuals that are at both ends of the scale are the ones you won't be right with. So it is a drawback. And so quantitative data is used to generalize, not to predict individuals. And qualitative data generally can't be used to generalize because it's from such a limited sampling of people. Questions, thoughts?
Hey, Dr. Bold, I got a question about, and I think you kind of answered part of it already with that last statement, but so for like a quantitative study, are there certain standards that you need to meet for a sample size to make sure that that's generalizable to a population?
Yeah, and it's not all that much, but it is we have this thing that's called power and effect size, and the more powerful the statistic is, or the measure is, or the stronger the data is, the more likely you are to see smaller effects. My analogy is always that I'm looking at a wall, 50 feet away. If there's a 3-inch crack in the wall, I'm going to see it, even as blind as I am. But if it's a, half a centimeter crack in the wall, I'm not necessarily going to see it from 50 feet away. Why? Because the effect, the size of the crack, my instruments from 50 feet away are not powerful enough to see it. And so that's the same thing with size of sample and statistics. The bigger the sample is, up to a couple hundred or whatever, the more you get kind of this, growth and power. But what happens is that then it begins to flatten out. And by the time you get to, say, 500, you didn't get any benefit from going from 350 to 500. Might as well stay at 350. And so it's directly related to how big the effect is you want to see, you're interested in seeing, and therefore how powerful the experiment is to find it. So there's some formulas out there that people use to predict the right size of sample, but they're at best guidelines. Because if you really think about it, if you pick the one representative person that represented the whole population, the one that's perfectly in the middle of everything you're trying to measure, that's the only sample you'd need. You just need the one perfect person, but you can't expect to get the one perfect person. So if you have sample sizes of 25 or 30, they're in pretty good shape. Yeah.
All right, thanks. And that's basically out the window with qualitative then. right? Like you
Yeah,
said.
because you can't collect that much data. You know, if you interview somebody, say you did 2 hours worth of interview with an individual, that may turn out to be 100 pages of transcript. And you know, you can't manage that much data.
Right.
And so you dive really deeply into a smaller number of subjects. And very often they're picked very purposely. I mean, you're not going to pick somebody that's, I don't care one way or the other. I mean, you're going to pick people that have some feelings about things because you have biases about things. And on the qualitative side, you're allowed to use your lens through which to look. Because when you report it, you're going to report that. You're going to report what you believed and the direction you were coming from and all that. So it's an entirely different ballgame. It's from my perspective, it's really much more interesting to do good qualitative work. But it's for a lot of purposes, it's much more practical to do quantitative stuff. So
Okay, thank you.
the doc program gets my quantitative side next semester when we do the advanced statistical piece. But even that's not too bad. Yeah. Other thoughts, other questions? What is it? It's been about an hour. I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to work on the video, the other video I put up probably tomorrow. Hopefully get that up tomorrow, and try to frame a little bit more about the quantitative stuff, a little bit more detail in terms of, you know, exactly what kind of designs are typical designs and what have people done for, you know, ever since we started doing this 150 years ago. But, you know, I think we'll stop there, and then we'll pick up there next Monday, and we'll delve into the qualitative pieces. And there are a couple of readings on the qualitative folder that you might want to take a look at, you know, at least one of them, that talk about the types of qualitative designs and types of qualitative issues. There is also two little brief little handouts on the quantitative side and a folder up on As You Learn Too. But they're, you know, essentially the first one is kind of what I just talked about to a certain extent. And then the second one goes a little bit more detail into actual structure of methods. Yeah. Questions, comments? If you need to talk to me, yeah, let me know.
This has been very helpful to understand the process even more, so I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, I'm not good with structure, as you know, but the logic part I'm okay with. But you know, the structure part, I have some issues every now and then.
No,
Yeah.
this is because understanding the framework of, you know, how to set this up, and so I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm glad to do it. And you know, as I say, if you need help or we need to do a one-on-one or whatever, give me a yell. Otherwise, I'll be here again Monday night if you hear of anybody else.
Wonderful.
Dr. Bolt, thank you very much.
All right,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you.
Very
Okay.
helpful. Thank you.
Y'all have a great evening.
Thank
Okay, you
As
too.
well.
Still catch the football game here in a minute. Yeah. I had no idea there was one on, actually.
I have a paper to write. Sorry, I can't do it.
That was good,
All right.
Mitchell.
Y'all have a good one.